Okay, so let's see the practical app you are going to develop at the end of these lessons. So this is the source code you will be developing, and once you run it, you will see a web application, and this is a survey system. You are going to develop a real world survey system, and this is a complete project where the admin can log in, can register if they want, or they can log in using their previous credentials. Likewise, and sign in, and then admin will be taken to the admin dashboard, which has lots of options such as to define the questions. These are all coming from the database dynamically, and you will learn how to add, edit, delete the data and populate the data dynamically likewise, and define the questions so the data will appear dynamically. And then you will learn how to create settings pages and save the data to the database once again, and see who are the respondents who has taken this survey, and with the log information. You will learn how to create sophisticated search dashboards, and you will learn about how to filter data and search, where admin can find information about different users who has taken the survey. So and then if I log out, and then a normal user, if a normal user comes to the home page, a normal user can start taking the survey. A user can register if needed, or if not, a user can take it anonymously. User will be able to take this anonymously. Let's say if this is test2 user, so test2 at, so, and if user says no, I don't want to register, and if user says next, then the survey will start anonymously, and all the data is coming from the database. So you learn about connecting to a remote database, which is not in this computer, it's on a remote server. So you will learn how to do that, and then you will learn how to take the survey questions, and there will be multiple survey questions. So I will just fast forward this. So I fast forwarded the questions, I just click next and answered them. And final question is, what is the state? So if the user says okay, this is the state, and click next, and these are the questions I answered. So and then the user or the respondent can review them and submit the answers. So then the data will go into the remote database. So you will learn about how to save it, and click next, and then it takes the user or the respondent back to the home page. So this is the app you will be developing at the end of these lessons. And the specialty of this app is it's a data driven app, and it's completely dynamic, and all the data is coming from the database, and there is admin dashboard, a sophisticated admin dashboard, and a separate user sessions. You will learn the complete source code from the scratch to develop this. So let's go and develop this application now. Let's start doing it now. Hi everyone, welcome to ASP.NET Complete Project Service System Part 12 User Registration Continuation. So this is the continuation of a complete project which is we develop according to real world development standards, and basically as how real world developers are working. So we will be getting that experience. We'll be using these tools for this lecture, and make sure that you cover these prerequisites before you do this lecture. So here you will be learning in this session about how to save to the database the user respondent registration details, and here we will be doing it without using any SQL helper class. And in another lesson after this we will use SQL helper class, and after this we will run SQL in the backend and check whether the data has been saved. As usual, it's going to be practical demonstrations. So now let's go and do the practical now. So in the previous lesson, we did up to this point where we declared the form with all the validations and with calendar control. So now let's complete this by saving this data into the database. So let's do it now. So this is the project up to the last lesson. So we will continue the same project. So make sure to look at the previous lesson to get this project. So let's go into view, because that is where the ASP pages are, and this is related to respondent, so we have to go into respondent, and then respondent registration page, and design and the front end. So let's double click on the register button. So this is where you have to save the data to the database. So let's do it step by step. So first of all, let's say we want to get the data from these text boxes. Let's get those data into variables. So let's start with the first text box. So the first text box is text box email, then dot text. So you will get the text and you will put it into a string variable. So then we will get the data from the other text boxes as well. Okay, so make sure to write this code and get the data from the other text boxes. Right, now we have the data from the text boxes. So now we need to get a connection, let's say to the database or the connection string, right? So let's work on that now. So in an earlier lesson, we created this DB utils class in the utils, inside the utils folder. So now we can use the DB utils and call get connection string to get the connection string to the database. So let's do it now. So let's go to this, let's go to register, and now let's call that method and get the connection string. So over here, if I type that type the name of that class, which is db underscore utils. So for me to access this class, first of all, if I go to the db utils, it is in this namespace, right? So I have to copy this and go in my respondent registration page. At the top, I have to say I'm using it, that namespace, right? So once you do that, then you can call the db utils. Now it's coming, and now you can call the method get connection string. It's a static method, so you can call it, and this is returning a string. So you can store the return value in a string. So let's create a string now and put the return value likewise. So now you got the connection string. So using this connection string, now you can connect to the database. So let's see what are the next steps now. Now let's say I would like to call a method and get this done. So I will create that method first over here. Let's say private void, and let's call that method as register respondent. So this is our own method, and my plan is then to call this method from here, right, like this, so that the registering the respondent logic can be inside this. Now into this, because I am asking that method to do it, I'm I should think like this. So I should think, okay, I got the connection string here. So then, because I'm asking that method to save it to the database, so I will pass this connection string as a parameter into that method, so that that method can look after saving the data using this connection string. So that is the first step. Then the next step is to pass all this data, the S email, S given name, as parameters into the same method. So let's declare, let's pass one parameter. So let's say email. So the reason for doing it this way, so that uh, that method will look after registering the respondent. This method I am declaring now. So likewise, let's pass all the parameters. Okay, so I wrote the code and fast forward it. So similar to the email, pass all this and declare all this like this. So make sure to do it now. Then we have the method. Now inside this method, we can write the logic to register the respondent to the database. Okay, so now when a respondent is going to register, I need to check whether the respondent has already been registered on a previous occasion. Sometimes this email might have been already registered. So for that, I need to check the database, run SQL, and see if the email is already registered. Now, so for that, I prefer to write another helper method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write another helper method, which I call it as get respondent registration ID. So the purpose of this method is we'll be passing the connection string and the email, and then we want this method to check the database and see if this email is already registered and return a value. So I have put it as integer, and I will explain why it is. But for now, let's keep going forward. So the purpose of this method is to see if this email exists, and if the email exists, I want this method to return the registration ID. That means the existing registration ID of this person, right, or the respondent. So for that, I'm creating a variable called respondent registration ID, and I'm putting an initial value of -1 because I'm considering -1 as not registered, but I'm going to see whether it's registered. If registered, I'm going to find the registration ID instead of -1. And finally, the plan is to return this respondent registration ID. And when this method, if this method returns -1, I will know that the respondent has not registered with this email. But if this method returns any other value other than -1, that means this respondent is already registered and that I am getting the existing registration ID. So let's continue doing this now. Also, to support this, I'm going to go to the dbutils class, and I'm going to add another method into this down. So let me fast forward the coding. So this method, I just fast forwarded it, will return a SQL connection. So for this to work, I have to make sure that I import the SQL.data.SQL client over here at the top. So what this method does is it will, so this is what you have to create. So it creates a SQL connection for this connection string. That means it will connect to the database and get a connection and return that connection. So this is what this code does. So carefully write this code. Now I'm going to call this method from over here. So let's do it now so that I can connect to the database. So how you do it normally in C# coding is you will say using, and then you will call that dbutils.getConnection method, which I wrote just now, and then once again I have to import the relevant SQL package. So I'm going to import system.data.SQL client from inside the code over here. Awesome, right? So this is how you call that method, and what the using block does is it does the memory management. What it means is inside this block, when you finish this block, it will make sure that it manage and clean the memory allocated for these objects. So that is something to do with memory management, right? So now let's go forward. So the next thing you will do is you will create this command, SQL command, and you will write the SQL statement, which means from your respondent registration table, that is where if the respondent registered, that is where the data is. You are trying to select the ID from this table where the email is matching to this given email. So you are checking whether this email exists. That is what this SQL does. And if that email exists, it will select the ID, existing ID. So now the next thing is you have to open the connection, and then you have to provide this parameter. So I'm going to fast forward the code. So let's do it. So now this connection, what you created here, you have to open it, and for this SQL command, you have to add property parameters, and then you have to say add with value, and for this parameter you are passing, you have to say okay, what is the parameter real value. So that is what you get over here. So you just pass it over here. So this is how you pass a value into a SQL command. Now the next thing is you have to execute this and then see if you got the data. So first of all, let's execute this command now. So I'm going to fast forward the code. This is the code. So what you say is on the command, you will call execute reader, and that method will return SQL reader. So now you need to check whether this method has returned any data. So if you can do it by putting a if condition, and if you say rd.read, if there is data, it will read the data, right? And if you look at this method, it returns a boolean, right? So if this command gives you some data, this condition will be true and it will read the data. Otherwise, else means it has no data. But read true means there is data, which means this email is already registered. In that case, I have to get the existing ID. So for that, I'm going to write the code. I'm going to fast forward it. This is the code for it. So what you do is, now you know there is a ID for that email. So what you do is, you will say RD means your SQL data reader. Then you, within square brackets, you will tell the ID, you want the ID. And this thing you have to say .toString and convert it into a string. And then that you have to convert into an integer. So that whole thing you will say convert .toInt32. That whole thing will give you the ID as a integer, and you will put that to this respondent registration ID. So initially it was -1, but now it will get whatever the respondent registration ID. Awesome. So that is all what this method should do. So when you run this method by passing a connection string and an email, it connects to the database. Initially it is -1, but if there is a ID, then it converts it into an integer and stores it and returns. So if this read is not okay, if there is no data, what happens is this line will not execute, because if there is no data returned by this SQL, then what happens is you will return this. So what it returns then is -1. So if there is data, it will get the ID and it will return that ID. But if there is no data, that means there is no else, which means this initial -1 is what is going to get returned. So it gets a ID only if there is data returned by the SQL. So overall, this method returns either the registration ID or -1. So that is what this method does. So let's put a comment so that it is more clear. So let's put a comment over here and say, okay, let's say that this method returns, okay, so let's just align it. Okay, so let's say that this method returns respondent registration ID if the email exists. That's this part. If the email does not exist, it returns -1. So if there's no email, this -1 is the one which gets returned. Awesome. So that is what this code block does. Now let's see what is next. So because the alignment went wrong, I just undo the comment for a second, but you can see there's a bracket is also missing. So make sure very carefully, otherwise this code will not compile. So for these brackets, there should be a closing bracket. Awesome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first put the comment symbol, and then I'm going to write the comment. Let me fast forward writing the comment. Awesome. So now that method is completed. So now we are going to call this method from register respondent. So let's do it now. And the way I have written the code, I don't need to pass this connection string, though I initially thought I have to pass it. So I'm removing it. The reason is because I am directly calling get connection. So I don't need that connection string. Also, I will not need that here as well. So I'm going to delete it because I'm directly calling get connection. So just make sure to delete those two. Now from register respondent, I'm going to call that method and see if that email is registered. So I'm going to fast forward the code. I'm calling this method and I'm passing the email which I'm getting, and I'm getting the respondent registration ID. So if this ID is -1, I know that the user is not registered, right? So I'm going to write put a if condition, and basically what I'm checking here is if it is not equal to -1. What does this mean? Now one thing, you have to be very careful with these brackets, because I wrote this if condition, one curly bracket went away, so I just have to put it. You also will get this a lot when you do this exercise, so very carefully look at your curly brackets. So this means the email, if it's not equal to -1, what this means is this email is already registered. That is why it is not -1. There's a value, it's not -1, which means the email is already registered. In that case, I want to inform the respondent and say, sorry, this email is already registered. And then what I can do is I can put this existing ID into the session, so that I can use it when this survey is continued. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this respondent registration ID into the session. So this is how you put a value to the session. You can give any key here. If you want, you can put X, but it's meaningful to put respondent registration ID. So I'm putting that, and then I'm putting that to the session, and that will have this value because the email is already registered. So now what I want to do is I want to inform the user, telling, okay, your email is already registered, so that you don't have to register again. So normally in programming is, in a situation like this, you return some status code like an integer, and so then the other method calling this method can get the return value instead of void, and then find out with what is the result of this method. When I say what is the result, what I mean is, now in this case we have to say, oh sorry, this email is already registered, so that is the result. So I need to pass this result now out from this method. I need to return this result. So how do we do that? So how do we do that? Let's do it. Let's look how we do that in the next lesson, right? So let's look at the slide now. Okay, so we did the practical demonstration up to a certain level. So the conclusion is we started writing code to save to the database, but we have to complete this, and we are yet to do running the SQL and all in the backend. That we'll be doing in the next lesson. So we'll be using these references. We have been using these references for this lecture. So make sure to look at the next part to complete this project. So this is a complete project which we show how real world developers are developing a real world application. So make sure to look at the next lesson. We are very excited to see you in the next lesson. See you all in the next lesson.